Welcome everyone. Again, my name is Daniel Wilson with the California Department of Social Services Family Centered Practice Unit. And in our unit, we oversee and support Wraparound, the Assist Specialized Permanency, the California Integrated Core Practice Model, parent and youth partners, and safety organized practice. And we're really excited to bring this webinar to everyone today. County Fiscal Letter 2021-94 was released about a month ago with comprehensive claiming instructions for California Wraparound, minus all of the Family First Prevention Services Act work that's going on. So this letter does not include anything in regards to FFPSA. That will be in forthcoming letters. This is really an update of claiming instructions for California Wraparound from with all of the changes that have happened between realignment and continuum of care reform and other changes, really to have a comprehensive claiming letter in regards to that incorporates really all of those changes that have happened. So thank you all for being here. We've been looking forward to providing both the letter and the webinar for quite some time now. So we're really excited about this. Just a few housekeeping items. Folks are unmute. You can type if you have questions, you can type those into the chat feature and into the Q&A box. We're going to hold off on answering any questions until the end of the webinar in case any of the materials are or any of the content answers your questions, and we'll also hold off on answering any case-specific questions on the webinar today. So with that, if you have case-specific questions, we'll provide an email that you can contact to run case-specific scenarios through our fiscal policy folks. So with that, I will turn it over to our folks in fiscal policy here at the California Department of Social Services, and I'll let them introduce themselves as they, or you know what, I'll just turn it over to Tammy in fiscal policy, and Tammy and then John and Elisa, if you all want to quickly introduce yourself, your name, and kind of who you're with, and then you can get started. But I do think, I just got a reminder, we do have a poll or two that we're going to use to get folks started. So before I kick it over to our fiscal policy folks, I think we have a poll that we can launch just to get an idea of who all's here. So the poll is on your screen now. We have two questions. The first is, which organization are you associated with? And the second question, have you taken the Children's Services Fiscal Essentials course through the UC Davis Resource Center for Family Focused Practice? And the third question is, are you familiar with the basics of the child welfare claiming process? For example, the CA 800 form and the county expense claim form. So I think folks are locking in their votes right now. This always reminds me a little bit of, for those of you who watched America's Funniest Home Videos, when Bob Saget used to say, lock in those votes right now. That's always what the polling reminds me of on Zoom. We have about 78% of people who have voted. So great, I see a lot of child welfare fiscal people here. That's great. And some general familiarity with child welfare claiming processes. Right, I'll give folks just a couple more seconds. We're at 82%. Any last poll takers, jump in right now. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, we can go ahead and close out the poll now and share the results. Awesome. So which organization are you associated with? We have a lot of child welfare folks here, which makes sense. This is primarily directed at child welfare claiming. I am so excited we have so many child welfare fiscal folks here because really that's the crux of the audience. We need both program and fiscal folks here, but definitely our fiscal teams and fiscal folks to be able to support this, and a decent amount of behavioral health program folks here. So that's great to hear, and I'm so glad we have our fiscal partners here. So as we scroll down the poll, the question, have you taken Fiscal Essentials? Almost half has taken it, a little over half has not taken it. Definitely encourage everyone to check out the UC Davis Resource Center for Family Focused Practice to explore the Children's Services Fiscal Essentials training, which gives a really great foundation to understanding how the fiscal claiming process for between county child welfare departments and CDSS works. So some of you may hear some of the information in the webinar will build on that training. And a few more than half of folks are familiar with the basics of child welfare claiming. So the CA 800 and the county expense claim form, et cetera. So that's great. We have a good foundation of knowledge here. I think that'll be really important as we move forward for counties who are here and you know your fiscal partners are here. Feel free to chat each other. Feel free to chat each other in the chat feature or email each other to exchange ideas. And thoughts about as you learn about the CFL as we move through the webinar. So with that, thank you all for taking the poll. And with that, I will turn it over to Tammy. Tammy, feel free to jump in and go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tammy Singleton. I am from the California Department of Social Services, the Fiscal Policy and Analysis Bureau. I am glad you are all here, and I will be going over the overview of the Wraparound Program. Very happy that this CFL has finally been released. It was a long time in the making, and so I will just provide you with a brief overview and background of the Wraparound Program. Next slide, please. The Wraparound Program was originally established in California under the Senate Bill 163 to allow California counties to develop the wraparound model using state and county foster care dollars. After the initial pilot ended in 2001, Wraparound became a fully operational program available to all California counties. And it allows the flexibility to provide wraparound services to children in group homes. Wraparound is a family-centered, strength-based, and needs-driven planning process for children, youth, and families. It takes place in a team setting. And wraparound payments can be used for services, care and supervision, or both. Wraparound provides children and youth who have complex needs with comprehensive and cost-effective, intensive, coordinated, and individualized interventions and links to services. Any unspent wraparound funds not used for specific child placements and or service costs may be put into the county wraparound trust fund account. Wraparound is a collaborative approach for the care that encourages coordination across agencies, disciplines, and communities to enhance outcomes of children and families. I will now turn it over to John Sanfilippo, who will continue with our presentation.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is John Sanfilippo. I work in the System of Care branch along with Daniel. It's our new branch in CDSS. And under our program, we primarily deal with rates, rate policy, and we deal with eligibility and payments quite a bit. And the other piece is we work quite often with our fiscal counterparts. And so, I want to start off by saying good afternoon, and I hope you find this webinar useful, and that at the end of the webinar, you walk away with some valuable knowledge about how the wraparound payment can be paid and claimed. And so with that in mind, I wanted to first talk a little bit before we jump directly into the information on your screen about care and supervision, placement, and then services, because I think it's important. I've been in the department quite a long time, and often there is a disconnect between fiscal folks and program folks when we think we're using common terminology. So I want to get us grounded here and talk about some of the terms here. And I think it's important, and I will stay focused on slide 3. But when we use the term wraparound payment, it really can be used very broadly. And by that, I mean a wraparound payment can include a lot of different placement scenarios. And specifically by that, I mean, you can have a wraparound payment for a child who is at home with their biological parent or parents and at risk of entry into foster care. And then you can have a wraparound payment for a case where a child or a non-minor dependent is already in an out-of-home placement, and the county is paying a foster care rate. So when we look at the types of payments, when we're talking care and supervision, it's really important to kind of get the details of a case. So for example, when we have a federally eligible foster child in a foster care placement, and they are receiving wraparound services, we can call this a wraparound payment. And in terms of how fiscal looks at this, there's really 2 components to the wraparound payment. There's one for care and supervision, and that is a foster care maintenance payment, and that's going to pay for those placement costs. And the second component is considered a services portion of the wraparound payment, which pays for services. And these 2 components, especially on a federal case, they're separated, and they're broken out in part because of how a foster care payment can and cannot be used. And foster care, and especially in eligibility, and our fiscal folks as well, one of the limitations of a foster care maintenance payment when the child is in a foster home, STRTP, or a foster family agency, and they're Title IV-E eligible. Title IV-E regulations clearly define how that foster care maintenance can be used. And you're going to hear a lot of different terms. It's care and supervision, it's a board and care rate, it's a foster care maintenance payment. But I hope the one takeaway you get, either programmatically, I'm sure our fiscal folks know that, is the limitation for use of the foster care maintenance payment, it does not pay for services. So it's care and supervision for that child. It's paid to a resource family, again, FFA or STRP. And then these 2 components, care and supervision, when we're paying a foster care rate, and we're using services, bringing wraparound services into the home, they're also broken out for claiming purposes. And that'll be discussed a little bit later. I want also to make sure we're grounded in the terminology is, again, wraparound payment could be used for many different types of scenarios. Kid could be at home at risk of entry into foster care, and they could be receiving wraparound services. And then the wraparound payment can be used for other programs. We're not just discussing foster care here today. It's available for KenGap, ARC, AAP, and it includes both a case where the child is a dependent, or if it's a youth, a probation youth. When we talk about sources of funding, so realignment kind of made wraparound claiming and understanding it a little bit more complicated. But essentially, here are just some key points to remember when we're talking. We'll stick with foster care cases here, if the case is federal or non-federal. So a federal case, again, the child is 4E eligible, the child or the youth, and they're in and out of home placement. Essentially, the county is going to pay 100% of rate, and they're going to get reimbursed 50% for those placement costs with Title 4E funds, again, for an eligible child. They're generally speaking, there's a little caveat here that we'll talk about later. Generally, there is no state general fund share of costs post 2011 realignment, and that's kind of what that last bullet alludes to. And then also, I wanted to discuss, so for a state foster care case, and I want to make a note, when we're determining eligibility for foster care, if the child is not Title 4E eligible, they may be eligible for the state foster care program. So if they're eligible, they're in a place in a resource family home, they're going to get the same rate paid. But essentially a state case now, because of realignment, the county is paying 100% of those placement costs. There's no FFP or Title 4E. And again, with the caveat, there is no general fund share, even on a state foster care case. So essentially, the county's paying 100% of those costs. When we're using these terms, local revenue fund and county-only funds, we received a lot of questions prior to issuance of the CFL. And so I just want to make a note about that, the difference between the two. So the local revenue fund, this is the state tax dollars that are collected via the state sales tax and the vehicle licensing fees. And essentially, the state passes these funds now directly into the county's local revenue fund. Okay, it's instead of the state general fund pre-realignment, the local revenue fund from sales tax and vehicle license fees goes straight into the county local revenue fund. County-only funds, that's a separate pot of money that is available to county welfare departments, and that comes from local tax dollars. And then the other important thing to note here when we talk about this term, before we go to the next slide, when we talk about a wraparound trust fund account, if the county has one, that's where they're going to dip into that wraparound trust fund account to pay for services. And the account can be used flexibly to serve just about any child in the child welfare system. The other term that has been thrown out here when we use this term wraparound trust fund account, it's essentially, it is pooled funds. So please make a note of that. So slide 4, federal versus non-federal eligibility. Essentially, we also wanted to talk a little bit more about this because, again, based on some of the questions and feedback we got from the CFL, I just want to make it really clear when we're talking about these types of cases that typically the county eligibility worker is determining the child's eligibility to either federal foster care, or again, if they're not federally eligible, they may be eligible for the state program, which is non-federal. If the child is 4E eligible, the county eligibility worker is going to assign that federal aid code 42. That's going to authorize a payment. So the county is going to be able to make that federal payment directly to a resource family or an FFA. If it's a non-fed foster care case, it's aid code 40. That's what's assigned. And it's important too, as some of you may know, these aid codes are really critical. As you'll see later on, they tie the child or the youth's eligibility to Medi-Cal. So assigning aid code 42 or 40 essentially makes that child categorically eligible for full scope Medi-Cal benefits. So the foster care eligibility worker in the county, it's important to know when they're assigning these aid codes, how it impacts the claiming when the wraparound rate is used for a foster care case. But I want to make the distinction here between this term eligibility has been thrown about. The foster care eligibility determination process has nothing to do with determining when wraparound services or when a wraparound rate can be authorized. Those are two different things, okay? It's important to note, again, the foster care maintenance payment, it's limited to paying for the cost of care and supervision. Counties can draw down 50% of the Title IV rate paid to a caregiver or foster care provider for the board and care portion of the wraparound rate of a federally eligible child. And then when a child is returned home, the county can no longer pay or claim maintenance costs. So the wraparound rate is reduced by 50%. And then the remaining amount is available to pay for services. Some of this will come out when we get to example one. And this may be obvious, but I'll state it again. Anytime a child or a youth is in and out of home placement in foster care, and they are returned home, the county can no longer use a aid code 42 or 40. And in fiscal, you'll hear that term assistance payment. That's the foster care rate, that's the board and care. So they can no longer claim those maintenance costs to those aid codes when the child is returned home. Obviously, they're not in foster care, and a provider or a resource family is no longer providing care and supervision. I want to go on to the next slide. And we're gonna dive into example one here. So off to your left, you see the wraparound rate for a Title IV eligible child. And in this example, they're transitioning from the STRTP to a home-based placement in an FFA. So the split below, or actually off to your side, is how the county was claiming prior to the child being transitioned home prior to the child being transitioned to a home-based placement. And again, that key word there is prior. So right now, if you have a federal case and the youth is placed in an STRTP, this is what's happening. What you see here, the STRTP rate, essentially it's split in half. The county is going to pay the full amount and turn around and get reimbursed for half of it, 50%. So the caveat that I mentioned up in one of the prior slides, that there is a little bit of general fund for the non-federal costs include funding realigned to county. and a general fund portion for subsequent rate increase. So what that says is there actually is a little bit of general fund for the foster care rates. And that the general fund is a small amount. It just only paid the increase to the foster care rates because of CCR reform. So we have our level of care rate, we have a foster family agency rate, and then we have the STRTP rates. So all those rates were increased through CCR and the rate reform. And so the state general fund only covered the portion of the increase, not the entire rate. So this is example one. Can we go on to the next slide? And we're going to kind of just walk through some numbers here. So under our example, the federal funds here available for the placement costs, the child is still in out-of-home care. They're placed in an FFA, and the total rate being paid is $1,500. This is that's going to be claimed on the CA 800 CCR Fed form, and it would be charged to aid code 42. And here is simply just the breakout of those costs. We're not paying the STRTP rate anymore. We're paying this $1,500 because the youth is in an FFA. So the federal share is $750, the county share is $750 here. So then what happens next is the county must deduct the placement cost from the wraparound rate. So after subtracting the placement costs of $1,500 from the STRTP amount, what you have here is a balance of $12,535. From this balance, the county must subtract 50% from this amount due to the loss of 4E. Okay, that remaining balance, 50% minus the 12,535 is that total there in the bullet. The remaining balance is 6267. That is what is available now to pay. That's what the county has available to pay from the wraparound trust fund account. And then those costs are reported as extraneous on the CEC. If the child or non-minor dependent needs additional services beyond this amount, the county can pay for those costs using the savings from the wraparound trust fund account or from those other accounts we mentioned earlier, their LRF and or county-only funds. Next slide. So the wraparound trust fund account, counties operate their wraparound programs and including their trust fund account. So they have autonomy to determine what wraparound rate is going to be paid to a provider. What's important for the county fiscally to know if the contracted amount exceeds the maximum rate, the county is going to be responsible for 100% of the cost to exceed that rate. And then as kind of diagrammed in example one, counties can utilize any unspent amounts in the wraparound trust fund account to pay for services. Again, the maximum rate for wraparound, the child or non-minor dependent, is the current STRTP rate of $14,035. As some of you know that have been kind of around a little bit longer, the wraparound rate used to be tied to the old group home rates. That was changed under CCR reform. And the rate you see in front of you, the $14,035, it'll change real soon here because a CNI, essentially a COLA will be applied to it. So there will be a little bit higher rate here. So using that example, it's example one, that's how counties can increase their funds in the wraparound trust fund account by implementing a high quality wraparound services program that strives to reduce or eliminate the need for children or non-minor dependents placed in foster care or in congregate care settings. The next slide. And this, when we use that term, a high fidelity wraparound program, I mean, essentially this is what wraparound was established to do. It's to serve youth in high-end placements and trying to transition those youth from a group home or from an STRTP to a less restrictive home-based setting. Or, getting reunified with the family is even better. So a county, essentially when they do this, they can reduce or altogether eliminate the assistance payment associated with those STRTP placement costs. And again, what they're trying to do is transition the youth from the STRTP either back home or to a lower level placement. And that's where the county is essentially saving money that should be redirected to the wraparound trust fund account. And so if the kid has been in STRTP for 6 months and you're paying $14,000, getting that kid to a lower level placement or at home reduces what the county would have otherwise had to pay for that youth. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to generally talk a little bit here about this slide. And there was, if you refer to the CFL, there was a table in there, and it's got a bunch of PC codes for 165. So that was page 5 of the CFL. But I wanted to briefly explain the difference between how the CA 800 county assistance claim and the county expense claim are used. We've already talked mostly about the assistance claim. So that's used to capture those payments made to resource families. Could be relatives, guardians, non-related extended family members made to different facilities, FFA, STRTP, okay? And it's essentially the assistance payment is a mechanism used for the county to make that payment and claim reimbursement for it. The other important thing to note is the assistance costs. They're paid monthly and they're reported monthly, and they're tied to that aid code. And that aid code, not only does it come with categoric eligibility to Medi-Cal, it also determines the funding source for foster care. That's AFDCFC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children Foster Care, is the funding source. So we have 2 programs, either state or federal foster care. And it determines sharing ratios. And then also, because we don't want to forget, the wraparound payment can serve youth in children or youth in the KINGAP, ARC, and or AAP programs. And so all of those programs have their own separate aid codes. But those, even for those programs, that assistance payment is made monthly, made on behalf of that child. The CEC is the quarterly reporting document for counties, for county agencies. So it's for them to enter the program expenditures for reimbursement of administrative and services costs. So when we use that term, administrative costs, it could include caseworkers, social workers, a county eligibility person who is conducting an eligibility determination. It could include staff support, and of course, the, expenses are reported on the CEC for county workers that are doing their time studies, just like we do at CDSS here in our department. So the services costs also include services provided directly to children and families. What's important to note on this slide, county expense claim, how it's used will be for a certain population of children and non-minor dependents. They have not had a Medi-Cal eligibility determination. They are not a dependent or ward of the court. So if there are services costs, this is the PC 165 code that's going to be used. And essentially it's funded at 100%. So let's go to the next slide. We've already talked a little bit about the assistance claim. What's important to note is just whether the case is federal or a state or non-fed case. And so on the assistance claim, all the federal cases are gonna be reported on the CA 800 CCR federal form. And it includes all those programs there that I previously mentioned. Accordingly, all the non-federal eligible cases will be reported for all those programs listed at the bottom: foster care, kin gap, AAP, and ARC. Those assistance costs, again, that's a board and care or a foster care payment, even a kin gap payment, are going to be captured on the CA 800 CCR non-fed form. So when a payment's being made, it goes on the assistance. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are a lot of nuances to how the wraparound rate is used and claimed depending upon the eligibility status of the case. So example 2, we have a non-federally eligible child in foster care. And they're placed in a resource family home. And the case is eligible for a wraparound program rate. So based on this, and this is what's different about a federal case versus state case. So the whole entire wraparound rate, both for assistance and services costs, are claimed to aid code 40 on the assistance claim. And that's how it is displayed below. So under this example, the funds for both the placement costs while the child remains in out-of-home care and all the services are going to be claimed under this aid code. So if they're placed within an FFA and the rate being paid is $1,500, the county can claim up to that full wraparound rate of $14,035 to aid code 40. And they're going to put it on the non-fed form. The breakout in percentages here is, again, realignment, making things, I guess, a little bit more complicated. The county share is 60%. And then what the remainder is that 40% is coming from local revenue fund. The local revenue fund, that is the portion that used to be funded by the state general fund. So once the county identifies these funds, the money can be put into the wraparound trust fund account and be used flexibly. If the next slide. So if the county has a contract with a provider or operates the program at the county level, the placement costs gets paid from the Wraparound Trust Fund account, okay? So if the county chooses to pay a wraparound provider $3,500 to deliver services, this is the amount that gets paid from the Wraparound Trust Fund account. And the balance, $10,535, is what's left. Again, we're using this example where the wraparound rate is $14,035. So the balance of that is $10,535. Okay. So this is the amount that's in that goes into the Wraparound Trust Fund account, and it's available to serve that child or other children that need wraparound services. The next slide, please. Okay, so example 3. Yeah, this one is a little bit different. So again, the full wraparound rate is being claimed. It's a non-fed case. So what you see on the left is the county share, county-only funds, and local revenue fund. And it's the non-federal child transitioning from an STRTP back home. So the county can continue to access the funds up to the STRTP rate of $14,035. Okay. The county continues to claim the rate on the CA 800 CCR non-fed form as outlined above, and the funds are put into the Wraparound Trust Fund account. Reminder, there's no more placement costs. The child is back home. So in this example, more funds are available now to pay for those additional services needed to support the child or non-minor dependent who has been returned home, or to pay for services of placement costs for other children and non-minor dependents needing wraparound services. The other thing that I'm going to go off topic here a little bit, just a little bit, because wraparound payments can be used for a case where the child is at home and they are at risk of being placed into foster care. And it could be a child or a youth. And so they're at home, there's no assistance dollars being paid, but the county can use the Wraparound Trust Fund account to keep that child with their parents and prevent their placement into foster care. It is, I'll use the term cost avoidance. It's another way that counties can try to use a Wraparound Trust Fund account to reduce their costs for running the wraparound program. So if the child's at home, if they want to bring in wraparound services and contract with the provider and say, you know, just theoretically, they want to pay $2,000 or $3,000, you know, for at least a month or two or maybe longer, you know, the county should think, you know, fiscally and programmatically, of course, what's best for that child. But it is a cost avoidance. I mean, if it's a youth, especially a probation youth, and they're at home with their parent, they could be at risk of entry into foster care and could even, you know, be placed in an STRTP. The county is going to be paying that $14,000 rate if that child ends up in a congregate care setting. So it's kind of another way to look at, you know, not only how to save money and put money in your wraparound trust fund account, but it's also kind of a wraparound model fidelity is, you know, thinking in terms of cost avoidance, reducing that potential placement in a congregate care setting. Example 3, again, non-federal kid, county can pay up to the $14,035. It tells you where they're going to claim it on the non-fed form. There's no placement cost. And then that money that goes into that wraparound trust fund account can be used flexibly for that child or any other child or youth, probation youth that is in the child welfare system. Okay, I'm gonna take a break there, and I hope my counterpart there, Elisa, can pick up some of the nuances that are addressed in the CFL in terms of claiming for specific programs.
Sure. We can go ahead to the next slide. All right, so we do have some information in the end of the CFL regarding claiming for specific programs. The first one that's identified here is emergency assistance foster care. As you can see on the slide, emergency assistance foster care is not eligible to be used to draw down the wraparound rate. So therefore, you have to use your wraparound trust fund to pay for wraparound services and supports if a family is receiving a child or the family is receiving the TANF emergency assistance foster care payment. So it's not that they cannot get wraparound services, it's that you can't use the C800 to draw down a wraparound rate on behalf of these youth. You have to use what you already have available in your wraparound trust fund. Approved Relative Caregiver Program, or what we call ARC. This is a similar situation. They're also eligible to receive wraparound services, but you cannot pay for those services with the ARC funds. The ARC funds can be used to make the placement costs, and they're claimed on the main payroll on the ARC claim. But when the placement is funded through an ARC payment and the child reunifies with a parent, a wraparound payments from the trust fund or utilizing your local revenue funds can pay for the services to the family to maintain the child in the home. We did add a new line in the CFL to the to the ARC claim to show that these wraparound services costs are funded through local revenue funds or county funds. Other portions of the ARC claim would be funded with state general fund that is used to pay for the ARC program, but this line would not draw down from those general fund pots. It would draw down from county or local revenue funds. You can go to the next slide. We also have extended foster care identified in the CFL. And so for extended foster care, that's for non-minor dependents, those that are 18 over that are eligible for extended foster care. And wraparound can be used to pay for these or provide services for these cases until they reach the maximum age of extended foster care. And so you would claim these costs very similarly to the way you would claim the under 18 population. You would mostly be using the the Aid Code 43 for extended foster care non-federal cases, similar to using Aid Code 40 for the under 18 population. And then you can similarly put these in the wraparound trust fund, same as you would for the under 18 population. Federally eligible cases can have the placement costs claimed on Aid Code 49, which is the federal aid code. And then you can also still utilize your wraparound trust fund as the match to draw down federal funds. For guardianship cases, this is cases that are placed with a guardian such as KinGap or FedGap. They are eligible for services paid for from the wraparound program, but this is another situation where you cannot claim the wraparound payments on the KinGap and FedGap claims. You can only use your wraparound trust fund or your local revenue funds or county funds for these cases. If the case remains in a placement with a KinGap or FedGap provider, they can continue to claim the payment dollars, but you cannot claim the additional wraparound services on the assistance claim. You can go to the next one. And we have adoptions last here. And so adoptions cases are claimed on the assistance claim, similar to the under 18 and extended foster care cases using aid codes 03 or 04, depending on if they're federal or non-federal. And so the wraparound cases are claimed on that summary report of assistance expenditures for adoption assistance, which is a federal form, or the non-federal form that's identified here. The increased AAP payment is in lieu of an out-of-home placement. And so if the AAP payment is insufficient to cover the needs of the child, the county can use their wraparound trust fund to pay for additional services. But this agreement is outside of the scope of AAP, and a separate agreement between the county and adoptive parents would need to be completed and signed to reflect the additional funding. So again, they can use their wraparound trust fund to pay for services that go above and beyond what's required through AAP, but it has to be a separate agreement. So counties should note that an AAP payment is specific to AAP eligible children and non-minors and may not be transferred to the county wraparound trust fund. Go ahead to the next slide. And I think that wraps it up from what we plan to present. I know there are some questions happening in the chat and the Q&A, but if you do have questions beyond what we're able to answer today, you can submit program-specific questions to the Wraparound Program email, which is wraparoundquestions@dss.ca.gov. And if you have specific claiming or fiscal questions, you can email fiscal.systems@dss.ca.gov.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elisa and team. And we'll make sure these email addresses are sent in the follow-up email. So we'll have a follow-up email with all the links that were in the chat, along with the webinar recording and the PowerPoint slides and the email addresses. So now I'm going to go through some of the chat questions, or the questions that were asked in the chat. If y'all have additional questions, feel free to plug those into the chat or the Q&A feature. If there winds up being a ton of questions in the chat and it's hard to keep track of, the Q&A feature helps. It's just organized in a way where I can make sure that we don't miss any questions. So I'll ask a question, and then John, Tammy, and Elisa, if y'all can just chime in to answer those. I think that would work. So we have a question around, does the Medi-Cal aid code identify which wraparound kids are federal or non-federal? What other way shows federal versus non-federal eligibility? And I think there's some ability to unmute folks too, if we need additional explanation of their question.
So I would say that the foster care eligibility does really kind of drive where you can claim payments for the most part. So if the case is federally eligible and is deemed to be eligible under Aid Code 42, we've outlined the instructions in this presentation and the letter. If it's a non-federal case, it's Aid Code 40. There was, again, the explanation about if they do not have a Medi-Cal eligibility determination, that they're going to be claimed through PC 165. If you're trying to prevent them from entering foster care, but still want to provide wraparound. So I hope that answers the question, but if there's more to it, then feel free to follow up.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So another question, is there a common table of the aid codes by Fed versus non-Fed that can be shared?
I don't know that there's a resource that outlines it quite that simply. All of the information would be identifiable on the claim forms. So your fiscal counterparts would be able to provide you that information at the county level. And I don't know if there's any kind of master document that identifies all the aid codes though.
Okay.
Oh, I believe there's a meds aid code list. Daniel, we can make that available with all aid codes.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. We can include that in the email too. And then the CEC and the CA 800, it sounds like would also be where you would reference that information, but we'll provide that in the follow-up email too. Let's see, so we had a question that was answered in the chat, but just so we catch it on the recording. In example one, just wanted to be sure that the dollar flow from and to the $1,500 placement cost is paid to the wraparound provider, question mark. That's a question. And then Elisa, you responded in the chat, the $1,500 placement cost would go to the placement provider or the placement provider.
Yes,
Right.
That's correct. So if you're still making a placement for an out-of-home case, you would continue to make that payment to the appropriate provider.
Perfect. And those three questions came in from the same person. So I think it's Belle. If you have any additional questions or clarification, you can raise your hand and I think I can unmute you. But if that answered your question, we can keep moving right along. Okay, perfect. And by your hand, I do mean your virtual hand, because I do not in fact know if you're raising your literal hand. Okay, so we had a question from Wendy. What do you know, or what is the CNI rate? Do you know the CNI rate?
The letter, the CNI rates letter will be issued as soon as the governor signs the budget. It's ready to go. And it'll be a listing of all the foster care rates, KinGAP, ARC, you name it, that'll be published. So as soon as the budget's signed, the ACL will be out there.
Perfect, thank you.
And the CNI increase, I believe it's only 2+% this year. So the rates won't jump up as high. But we'll have those exact numbers in the ACL.
Great, thank you. We had a question, can a county use the Wraparound Trust Fund dollars to fund services outside of Wraparound or for other costs?
Yes, they can, as long as that child or youth are considered, are being served or being considered to potentially enter foster care. Yes, they can.
And I'll add on that at CDSS, we encourage to make sure that before costs are used on any other program or services outside of Wraparound, that you ensure that your Wraparound program is high fidelity, high quality Wraparound. So just to make sure you're not inadvertently shortchanging your Wraparound program. So we had a question, are counties required to establish a Wraparound Trust Fund account?
I believe the answer to that question is no, although I understand most counties do have them. Counties are not required to draw down the full rate, the full STRTP rate. Counties have options to design their wraparound programs differently. Some counties choose to basically only claim exactly what is needed for the services up to that maximum and not put anything into a wraparound trust fund. So counties do have options, but it's not required.
Perfect, thank you. And we have several questions coming in, so I'll just, if you have a question in the Q&A or the chat, just hang in there and we'll get to you. So we had a question around are probation children claimable on the CA 800 and CEC forms? Does this instruction include probation youth?
Yeah, the claiming instructions for probation youth are essentially the same, and there's a line in the CFL that addresses that. So a probation youth and out of home care, they're federally eligible. You're going to use the same aid code 42 or 40.
Great.
I think it's just important to make sure that we're clear that probation does not submit those claim forms on their own. The county welfare department submits those. So you would have to be working with your county welfare department to ensure that you're able to get a reimbursement appropriately.
Yep, absolutely. We've had lots of conversations with counties around leveraging funds from across systems to support wraparound. That's an example of that. Having these discussions around leveraging resources to support county wraparound programs is a great conversation to have within the context of system of AB 2083 children and youth system of care work, which we can include some information about that in the chat feature too. So a question around, what about a probation youth who is at home and does not have detention findings? Are these youth still eligible for wraparound? Are they claimable also on the C800s or CEC forms?
So they're in home. They're not going to be claimed on the assistance CA800 fed or non-fed. Yes, you can bring in wraparound services. Those costs are likely going to be claimed to one of those PC 165 codes.
And the letter kind of spells out the eligibility criteria for that, which includes risk of entry into foster care.
Yes. Right. You can serve those youth. Yep.
Perfect. And then we have a question. How is the example of using the wraparound trust funds for a child not in placement different to pay for wraparound services? How is it that different or the same as the types of wraparound services that are to be claimed on the PC 165 on the CEC?
So to make sure I'm following, it's PC 165 as outlined in the CFL and the presentation today is intended to be for those youth that have not had an eligibility determination and are not in out-of-home placement. So it's really a preventative cost. You want to prevent a child from going into foster care. And so that's where you would claim those expenses is on program code 165. Alternatively, you could use your other wraparound trust funds. So obviously the intent is to build up your trust fund so that you can serve some of these additional youth. And if you wanted to claim directly from your trust fund and not utilize 165, you can also claim it through extraneous on the county expense claim.
Great, thank you. Okay, so moving on down the list of questions, lots of great questions. What is the distinction between the county share and the local revenue funds?
So in my view, on the fiscal side, they're both ultimately county funds at the end of the day, because realignment has turned over a lot of the funding to the counties. They both become county funds in our eyes. They're just kind of tracked a little bit separately through the claiming systems. We have to do the calculations the way we were doing them prior to realignment because of other 1991 realignment impacts. So the claims will still show a state share or identify it as LRF in that kind of middle column of a federal, state, county. But ultimately, LRF becomes county funds at the end of the day. So true county funds would be other county general funds.
And this is a great question that could be answered within the context too of the fiscal essentials training. All right, next question. For the amount to be put into the wraparound trust fund, is it the local portion or the county portion? So it sounds like, if I understand the question correctly, it sounds like it's what goes into the wraparound trust fund? Is it county general fund or is it LRF?
I think it would be both, depending on, the way that you're claiming the case. I think that it's anything that's other than the placement dollars, because you're making those, if they're in and out of home placement, you're making that payment still to maintain that placement, and whatever funding you have left over that's available could be put into the trust fund.
Let's see. Just scrolling through the questions. So a question, how do cases in wraparound slots get factored into the discount rate? If that question isn't clear, we can have the person, Carol, unmute herself to ask the question.
I'm not sure that that's I'll defer to Elisa, but we don't use wraparound slots anymore. So I don't know if that question is still relevant in terms of what the sharing ratio is. And what sharing ratio is she referring to?
I think they mentioned the discount rate specifically.
Discount rate? Oh,
so
okay.
The discount rate is for all of your foster care placements. Yeah. So if these youth are still considered to be in foster care, then you would have to include them in the discount rate according to their aid code for their eligibility.
Right. Yep.
Right. Moving through. Are there non-supplantation requirements around the use of wraparound savings?
Not sure I fully understand the question.
We can come back to that, or Carol, if you're still on and you want to unmute yourself, or you want to raise your virtual hand, I can unmute you. Oh, there we go.
Hi.
We can hear you, Carol. We're just getting a little feedback. All right, Carol, you can also type your like a follow-up to that question in the chat, and we can circle back to it. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next question while if Carol wants to type some additional information. So we had a question: if a federally eligible child returns home to parents, does the total wraparound service payment come from the trust fund?
But yes, when the child is returned home, yeah, those services are going to be paid through the trust fund.
Great, thank you. Can non-foster care probation cases in wraparound be claimed as non-federal on the CA 800?
Can you say that
repeat that?
question again?
Yeah, we may need a little more information. I think this is from Cynthia. Can non-foster care probation cases in wraparound be claimed as non-federal on the CA 800?
Did you say non-foster care at the beginning? Sorry.
Yes, yeah.
If they're not in foster care, you cannot claim them on the C800. They have to have an eligibility determination for foster care that's completed in order to be claimed on the C800.
Great, thank you. And then Cynthia, if you have more to follow up, you can always type additional information in the chat feature. A question from Doug, and another one we may need a bit more information. PC program code 165 is 100% funded by question mark. So is PC 165 100% funded by what source?
County.
On the claim, it's going to show as a 100% county share.
Yeah.
And so the county has the choice to determine how they want to fund that county share, whether it be actually using LRF, county funds, or their wraparound trust fund.
Great, thank you. So this question, and Elisa, John, if any of these questions seem like they need to wait until later or need to be emailed in because they're too specific, just let me know. So a question came in, can you give additional examples of times wraparound savings can be used for youth who are not wards and dependents other than for prevention?
It would be helpful if that one could be submitted to the
Yeah.
mailbox.
Okay.
The one thing that comes to mind is that I've heard of instances where, somebody has a sibling who's not in foster care, but they could benefit from some services, and you can use your wraparound trust fund for some of those instances.
Yep, that makes sense, to make sure you're serving the whole family. Since wraparound is a family-centered intensive case planning support process, and not just limited to the identified youth. But it sounds like if you have questions or about specific scenarios, you can email the either of the inboxes, most likely the fiscal systems inbox if it's fiscally related, and we can answer some of those fiscal questions. But I think an example may be continuing like wraparound services after dependency or wardship is terminated as well. So kind of after the fact, if the family would continue to benefit from wraparound services, would that fall into that category, John and Elisa?
Sure, yeah.
Okay,
And I
another
want to also make a note, because I don't think it was mentioned. If the child or youth is returned home and they're receiving family maintenance, FM, the county still has the flexibility or option to use the wraparound trust fund account to provide services, additional services. They have that flexibility.
Thank you, John. And just a reminder, so I'm getting to some very case-specific questions. So for case, there's a million different permutations of situations that folks may have questions about. So if your question is case-specific, please email that email inboxes that are on that are on the screen for case-specific questions. Give me just a second as it'll take me a second to read through each one. Okay, are child welfare cases in family maintenance and family reunification with Medi-Cal eligibility allowed to be claimed as non-federal on the CA 800?
Say that again, Daniel, please.
Are child welfare cases in family maintenance and family reunification with Medi-Cal eligibility allowed to be claimed as non-federal on the CA 800?
No. If the child is back home, the county may not claim any assistance costs on the CA 800.
So I think we want to pause there too and just clarify, assistance costs versus, like we were talking about at the beginning, wraparound costs. So if you look at example 3 in the letter, that's an example where a non-federally eligible child who was previously placed in an STRTP transitions back home. So I would assume that that means they're probably in FM or FR. And so in that scenario, you can still claim the wraparound rate on the C800. You put it into the wraparound trust fund. And then since there are no placement costs, you have more funds available to play for wraparound services. So I would take a look at example 3 in the letter.
Great, thank you so much.
But again, like John said, there's no assistance payment for that. You're claiming the wraparound rate on the assistance claim though. So it gets a little technical and confusing.
Yeah, that's the non-fed case.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so we have a question. Someone would like to confirm when we're talking about federal eligible or non-federal eligible, are we talking about foster care eligibility determination? Someone asked about Medi-Cal aid code being federal eligible, and I don't think that would determine fed or non-fed for wraparound purposes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I would say it also, go ahead, John.
Well, it's, on the Medi-Cal end, I think what's important is when eligibility determination is conducted and the child is either federally or non-fed eligible under a foster care aid code, in the med system, it automatically grants full scope Medi-Cal. So, I'm not, I don't know how they do that on their end. If that means they, assign a specific Medi-Cal code, but I just know it's the foster care aid code tied to the assistance payment that makes that case categorically eligible for Medi-Cal.
Great, thank you both. Okay. Are cases receiving aid code 5L state emergency assistance eligible for wraparound claiming?
So 5L is kind of the counterpart to 5K.
Yeah.
So I would say that you should look at the instructions related to emergency assistance foster care.
If the
Great.
question was, can they, for a case, 5L case, that was for emergency caregiver funding. Yeah, you could use wraparound services for that case. Again, the county has that flexibility to use those pooled funds or wraparound trust fund account for other types of child welfare cases. So if the home, 5L means the home is undergoing approval. And it will likely be, it could be a foster care case or an ARC case. So yeah, you can serve those types of placements as well.
And so it sounds like what we're getting at here and kind of the underlying theme is providing wraparound services or providing wraparound to a child or family. There's no limitation to who you can provide wraparound to. It's all about the limitations associated with the limitations and the requirements associated with their respective funding streams. And on this webinar, we're specifically talking about the funding stream that's accessed through claiming on the CA 800 and the county expense claim. So question, probation youth who has not been determined to be fed or non-fed eligible.
I think we've answered that one already, but basically you would be using the program code for preventative services or the wraparound trust fund claiming through extraneous.
Great, thank you, Elisa. So a question, is it necessary to claim to PC program code 165 if we pay for services directly from the wraparound trust fund?
Again, it's going to depend on the scenario specifically, but it could be if it's a preventative case, yes, you would utilize that. But if it's for you're just using the wraparound trust fund for other purposes, it might be that you claim it to extraneous.
Great, thank you. So if you have, for folks, if you'll have a specific or questions about a specific case, some of these get a little challenging to answer because there needs to be some additional information in the question, but because there's really so many permutations of the scenarios that can emerge, that case-specific questions should be sent to the inboxes on your screen.
Yeah, Daniel, and this is John. I want to encourage counties fiscally and programmatically to try to really, really work with the guidance in the CFL. It's not going to cover every single scenario, nor is it intended to. Just please, yeah, do your review and analysis of the CFL, and it's going to be a challenge to figure out, how to answer a lot of different case scenario questions. And I say that because this is the first CFL that updates claiming guidance, and we don't have regulations, so it's going to be difficult to research and find answers. It's going to be challenging to find answers for all the scenarios. So I hope folks kind of have keep that perspective.
Great, thanks, John. We have a couple of questions about wrap counts and slots, and I can try and answer this one. I don't think in regards to wrap counts and wrap slots, at CDSS, we don't approve wraparound slots anymore. Counties submit their claims for wraparound based on, the expenditure, the expenditures and the claims and the instructions that were provided previously, but we don't, because wraparound funds, quote unquote SB 163 funds were realigned, we don't approve specific slots. We don't approve specific slots anymore. Counties make the decisions about how to structure their programs and the capacity of their wraparound programs. Those decisions are made at the local level and funded through, or one of the mechanisms funding through county general funds, county realignment funds, and wraparound trust funds. Did I get that right, John and Elisa?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just reading another question. So I think we have a few more questions that are kind of case specific. So I'm going to skip over some of those. Let's see. So we have a question about Medi-Cal billing. And I'm going to say that's beyond the scope of this specific webinar, unless Elisa or John, y'all feel comfortable weighing in on Medi-Cal billing. But otherwise, that's kind of beyond the scope of this webinar. But it is additional guidance that the Family Centered Practice Unit is working on developing.
I agree with that, Daniel.
Okay. So for those specific questions, especially Medi-Cal billing, you can email wraparound questions, and we'll do some back and forth and technical assistance and try to connect you with the appropriate person. Let's see. can a child who is voluntarily placed in foster care, STRTP, can that child receive wraparound services on the CA 800 and then follow up wraparound services when they are returned home? So this is a question about how to claim a child who is voluntarily placed in foster care.
So the answer to both those questions is yes and yes. Voluntary placements, out of home placement, they're federally eligible for foster care. Those costs are going to be reported on the CA 800 federal form. And yes, you can bring in wraparound services to serve a child who's been voluntarily placed into foster care.
Thanks, John. So I see some questions about just county contracting being certified by counties. So Terry, I think that's your question. If you can direct that question to the wraparound questions inbox, that's kind of outside of the scope of the webinar today. And some questions about AAP cases who are receiving wraparound outside of the county. Yeah, so it's a great question. But yeah, send us an email at wraparound questions, and we will work on that with you directly. Okay, so a few more questions in the chat. That was in the Q&A that I was just reading out of. And I'm trying to screen the questions as I go a bit too, so bear with me. I believe the CFL stated the funds used from the trust would need to be reported on the CEC. Would you clarify this? And what if the trust is held by a third party and not with the county? So I'm assuming that's talking about in some counties where the wraparound trust fund is actually held by the provider instead of the county directly. Or if that would be one of those questions.
I have not heard of that. Okay, that's Alicia, have you heard of that?
Can you repeat it one more time? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it says the CFL states the funds from the trust fund would need to be reported on the CEC, but there are some counties who, and Brandy, this is from Brandy, I don't know if I'm categorizing this correctly, but there are some counties who contract, who provide their wraparound providers like the full or close to the full rate, and then their providers manage their wraparound trust funds. And so I think the question is, would that need to be provided on the CEC?
I mean, my basic understanding is if you're making a payment on behalf of a child welfare case, you're going to need to report it at least in extraneous when the expenditure is made to that contractor. So any dollar that the county is paying out for a child welfare case should get reported somewhere between the C800 and the CEC.
Thanks, Elisa. And I'll ask Brandy if you can email the wraparound questions inbox and or the fiscal systems inbox directly. We can have additional conversation about that. We'll use these, the questions that we're answering today to inform guidance going forward as well.
Hey, Daniel, I just want to note that the slides there are more examples in the CFL. So I want folks to make sure there's 2 more examples that we didn't go over. So it might be helpful if folks haven't read the CFL to look at examples 4 and 5.
Great point, John. Thank you. Shannon, I see a question from you that's a pretty specific scenario. I think just reiterating, if a youth who is at imminent risk of removal, but they don't have an open CWS CMS case, and there's a need to preserve them in the home, like these youth, and so really it's wraparound youth who haven't yet been removed. Can they be supported by the county wraparound trust fund to prevent entry into foster care, even if they don't have an open case in CWS CMS? And my understanding based on our conversation is yes, that the wraparound trust funds can be used to support youth who are at risk of entering foster care through probation.
Yeah. And that's that cost avoidance strategy that should be kind of looked at, when you're trying to adhere to the wraparound fidelity model. So, you always want to try to prevent entry into foster care. That should be goal number one. And, in this case, it should be goal number one, both programmatically and fiscally.
Great points. Thank you, John. So we have a couple of questions just about the wraparound rate. So basically, if there's an obligation at the county level to claim the entire rate, or can they claim just a portion of the rate?
It's up to the county. They can do either or.
Great, thank you. So still some confusion about where to claim the wrap service costs for those in fed versus non-fed placements, or the wraparound pieces that are for services for those stepping down to home-based placement. I would say, if there's still a little bit of confusion based on this, take a look at the CFL and spend some time with that. And if there's still some confusion, send us an email. Just still scrolling through the questions, so apologies if I get quiet. I'm just reading the questions. So a question, just some folks are learning through this that some folks had an assumption that all wraparound costs were handled through the CA-800, and this is one of the first times they're learning that it can be handled on the CEC form, and just kind of clarifying that and summarizing what was already stated. So definitely look at the CFL, which will help provide additional context to this webinar to help understand that. And if you still have questions, again, certainly email us. Bear with me as I scroll through. Let's see, if a child is back at home from out-of-home care, do we consider them as non-fed, the aid code eligibility determination? So if a child is back at home from, is returned home, are they considered non-fed at that point? The aid code eligibility determination is necessary only for cases in out-of-home care, is that correct?
Well, if the child is returned home on just a temporary basis, typically the eligibility worker is going to stop the payment, the assistance payment, but the case is going to remain open. So if their again, placement is at home on a temporary basis, and for some reason they need to go back out into their foster care placement, then the county eligibility worker is going to essentially activate that aid code again to be able to pay that foster care rate to a resource family or a provider.
Great, thank you, John. So we had a question about the CA-800. Someone said, if I'm understanding this correctly, the assistance placement costs are claimed through the CA-800, and that the costs associated with services are claimed through the CEC to PC code 165 as extraneous. And it sounds like that is not completely correct, that there's more nuance to it, where there are some situations where the full cost of wraparound placement and services are claimed on the CA-800. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
So so in regards to that question, there's a lot of different circumstances and situations where the services are claimed, where the wraparound services are claimed on the CA-800 versus the county expense claim. And so take a look at the CFL, and if you still have questions about general or specific cases, you can send us an email. Let's see. Question regarding program code 165 on page 5 for amounts claimed to PC 165. Do we also need to report the same amount under extraneous on the CEC? It sounds like those are separate, that they shouldn't duplicate. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So you claim one or the other, not both.
Correct.
Okay. Let's see. So for the wraparound trust fund, just confirming, is it essentially a trust fund where we would place our net savings from wraparound? Or is this presentation stating that all funding for covering wrap placements, service costs should be transferred to and paid out of that trust fund, and whatever is remaining in the trust fund is the balance of the account? So do they transfer? Do all costs flow through the trust fund, or are only net savings transferred into the trust fund? Or is that a county decision?
I was going to say, I think that's a county decision. I have heard that some counties are gonna, they wouldn't necessarily put the funds into the trust fund until they find out what their balance is. It's going to depend on your local accounting practices, I would assume.
Great, thank you, Elisa. So just somebody had a question about wraparound services for AAP. Is it claimed under Federal Aid Code 3, or should it be included in non-Fed 04? And it sounds like that would be based on the federal eligibility determination.
Yes, that's
Right.
correct.
Great, thank you. Let's see. We had some questions about sound. Just scrolling through. For a Fed case who is in wraparound and placement costs are paid, do the placement costs get reported under the foster care column or the wraparound column? And again, that was, let's see, a federal case receiving wraparound and placement costs are paid. The placement costs get do they get reported under the foster care column or the wraparound column, the placement costs?
Foster care
Okay, great.
on the CA 800 Fed.
Great. And I think we only have a few more questions. I haven't hit on every single question specifically, but tried to get the buckets of common questions that I'm seeing pop up. So we had a question: do we continue calculating the savings into the wraparound trust fund for as long as the foster care child continues to be in the home-based environment? Is there a time limit of when these calculations stop?
That's a good question. Not to my knowledge. I don't know if Lisa has anything to add to that.
Can you repeat it one more time? I'm sorry.
The full question is, do we continue calculating the savings into the wraparound trust fund account for as long as the foster child continues in the home-based setting? Is there a time limit of when these calculations stop? For example, can a case continue to add savings to the wraparound trust fund for multiple years?
That's a good question.
We can take that one back.
Yeah.
Okay. Programmatically, there's no state requirement around, there's no state limit or no policy around at the state level around time limits on receiving wraparound services. So
Right, it's my gut reaction as well on the fiscal side.
Yeah, but we can double check. That question is from Jose. Let's see, can we claim the actual costs paid to contractors for wraparound services instead of using the count and the wraparound rate?
Yes, you can choose to draw down something lower if it's based on your actual costs. That's an acceptable method. So then you basically would never have a wraparound trust fund if you're only claiming your exact costs.
Thank you. And if a county pays wraparound services using So we already addressed that last question. Just a question: if a county pays wraparound services using their trust fund account, is the payment still reported through the CEC or PC 165? And it sounds like that's a yes and it depends kind of question. It depends on the situation in terms of how it's claimed. So reference the CFL, and if that doesn't answer your questions, email us. Let's see. Okay, so here's a question. A question: if the placement cost is for Fed, if the placement cost for federally eligible youth is claimed to the foster care column, what is the wraparound column used for? Our understanding is that wraparound service costs are claimed to foster care non-Fed.
Yeah, I'm looking at an older CFL right now that kind of addresses that. It's CFL 010251. And so that CFL does say that when you're claiming the federal share of a concurrent placement cost when serving a federally eligible child in wraparounds, that you'd be using that separate column for that placement cost. So that's for if they're a federally eligible child served in the wraparound program and they're receiving the federal share of the concurrent placement costs.
Great, thank you. And I think those are pretty much all of our of the questions that have come in so far. We have a few that are, so a few of you have asked questions that are very situationally specific, case-specific questions that, again, we're not going to dive into here because there may be a lot of kind of back and forth conversation that needs to happen to obtain all the information we need in order to answer the question. So email us if you have case-specific questions. And we will, I had a question: if we're going to take all of these questions and form a FAQ document, we will be working on that. We'll try to get all of that together. That will take some time to organize all of the questions and the responses. So that may take a bit more time, but within the next week, we should be able to get out the webinar recording, the PowerPoint presentation, our email addresses that are on the screen, and links to the information that was put in the chat feature. So with that, I'll pause for just a couple more seconds to see if anyone has any additional clarifying questions. But I think we covered a variety of different areas and a variety of different clarifying questions. So I will just pause. Any additional questions? All right, well, thank you, everyone. It's been great spending time with everyone today. Great questions. We know this has been a needed webinar for quite some time, needed County Fiscal Letter for quite some time. So thanks for joining us. Mike from UC Davis included in the chat an evaluation for today's webinar. If you're able to take a few seconds to complete that, that would be great. It's in the chat feature. Again, if you have questions, email wraparoundquestions@dss.ca.gov or fiscal.systems@dss.ca.gov. If you email one of us, we'll get you to the right place. There's Wraparound is a complex program that has pretty complex claiming and programmatic instruction, so we'll make sure to get you to the right place. And then we see some questions also about other ISFC claiming trainings and AAP funding trainings. We will pass, we're not the people to necessarily do that, but we'll certainly pass along that information as a suggestion. And thank you to John, Elisa, and Tammy for your great presentations and the information you provided on how to support Wraparound fiscally. Thank you so much, everyone.